Let me tell you about a man who spent 22 years collecting what everyone else called garbage, and how the day a regional grain equipment company finally closed its doors turned out to be the best day of his adult life. Harlan Boudreau had a shop behind his house on a gravel road outside Portage, La Prairie, Manitoba, and if you drove past it on a Tuesday afternoon, you might have thought it was abandoned. The doors were always half open. There were always parts stacked along the outside wall under a corrugated steel overhang. There was always some kind of oil stain on the gravel that never fully dried. But if you stopped and walked in, you would have found a 61-year-old man bent over a workbench, reading a serial number through a pair of magnifying glasses, writing it into a spiral notebook with a mechanical pencil. Not a phone, a pencil. He had 4 of those notebooks on the shelf above the bench, their spines dated in black marker. The oldest one said 1999. His daughter, Simone, had asked him once, when she was home from Winnipeg for Thanksgiving, what exactly he was cataloging. He looked up from the bench, set the pencil down, and said, "Auger drive gearboxes." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. She went back inside and helped her mother peel potatoes. That was Harlan. He never over-explained. He figured the work explained itself eventually. What you have to understand about the grain auger business in that part of Manitoba is this. For nearly 30 years, a man named Stéphane Villeneuve ran the regional dealership for a mid-tier brand of grain handling equipment out of a beige metal building just off the Trans-Canada in McGregor, Villeneuve Agricultural Supply. The sign was green with gold lettering, and it had a little wheat stalk in the logo that Stéphane had designed himself. He was proud of that sign. He talked about it more than some people thought was normal for a grown man to talk about a sign. Stéphane Villeneuve was not a bad person, exactly. He was a businessman in the way that certain kinds of businessmen are, focused on the transaction, not the relationship. He had an exclusive regional distribution contract for this particular brand, which meant that if you farmed within about 100 kilometers and you ran their equipment, you bought your parts from him. That was the arrangement. That was how it worked. The gearboxes were the problem. The auger drive gearboxes on this particular line of equipment had a design flaw that everyone in the industry knew about, but nobody officially acknowledged. The input shaft seal would fail after 5 to 8 seasons, depending on how hard you ran the machine and how cold your winters got. When the seal failed, water got in. When water got in, the gear oil emulsified. When the gear oil emulsified, the internals started to wear in ways they were not supposed to wear, and eventually you had a gearbox that would not do what a gearbox is supposed to do. The manufacturer's position was that the gearbox was a wear item and was not covered under any extended warranty. Stéphane's position was that he could order you a new one for $460 plus labor. The farmer's position was usually something unprintable, followed by writing a check. What happened to the old gearboxes? Stéphane's guys pulled them and stacked them in the back of the parts bay. Officially, they were being held for core return. A credit from the manufacturer for returning failed cores was part of the dealership agreement, except the credit was $12 per unit, and the manufacturer's core return program had been quietly suspended in 2003, and Stéphane's parts manager, a quiet man named Cote, who had worked there since the building was built, had never gotten around to updating the system. So the gearboxes sat, and they kept sitting, and every spring when a farmer came in with another one, Cote would tag it and put it on the stack and mark it in the ledger, and the stack would grow by 1. Harlan Boudreau had bought one of these machines in 1998. He'd run it hard, the way you do when you're farming 500 acres by yourself and you can't afford downtime. His first gearbox failed in 2001. He drove it to McGregor, paid Stéphane's price, drove home, put the new one. He asked Stephen what happened to the old one. Stephen said, "We send them back." Harlan nodded. He went home. That fall, he took the failed gearbox off his neighbor's machine, a man named Truscott, who farmed the section to the east and couldn't afford the repair, and he drove it to McGregor with Truscott's core. Stephan's guy at the counter told him the core credit program had ended and they'd have to charge him the full amount. Harlan said that was fine. He paid. He asked if he could have the failed unit back. The counter guy looked at him the way you look at someone who's asked for their broken light bulb back. "It's scrap," the guy said. "That's all right," Harlan said. He put it in the truck. He drove home. He took it apart on his workbench that night, the way he always took things apart. Slowly, methodically, cleaning each component with solvent and laying it on a shop rag in the order it came off, like a surgeon organizing instruments. What he found was that the housing was completely intact. The shaft was fine. The helical gears were fine. 2 bearings were pitted from contamination, but otherwise serviceable if cleaned and repacked. The input seal was destroyed. The output seal was weeping. The gear oil looked like a gray milkshake. Harlan sat back on his stool and looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote in his notebook, "Seal failure both ends. Internals at 80%. Housing perfect. Resealing viable if correct seal sourced." He spent the next 3 weeks finding the correct seal. It wasn't listed in any of the parts cross-reference catalogs he had. He measured the shaft diameter, the bore diameter, the depth, wrote the dimensions on a piece of graph paper, and drove to a bearing supply shop in Portage, run by a man named Arsenault, who had been in the business since before metric was standard in Canada. Arsenault looked at the dimensions, looked at Harlan, looked at the dimensions again, and pulled a seal off a shelf that was used in a certain line of industrial pump manufactured in Germany. It cost $4.18. Harlan drove home. He pressed the seal in with a piece of pipe and a hammer. He repacked the bearings. He filled the gearbox with fresh 80W90. He mounted it on a jig he'd made from angle iron and bolted to the floor, connected his drill to the input shaft, and ran it for 6 hours. It ran smooth. It ran quiet. It ran the way it was supposed to run when it was new. He wrote in the notebook, "Rebuilt. Arsenault seal P.Na. 714. $4.18 in seals. 2 bearings at $12, total materials $28. Labor 4 hours." Now here is the part of the story where most people would have done something with that information. They would have gone to Stephan and offered a deal. They would have told a neighbor. They would have started a small business, put up a sign, made some phone calls. Harlan Boudreau did not do any of these things. Not yet. What Harlan did was ask Stephan, on his next trip to McGregor for something unrelated, whether there was any chance of picking up a few of those failed gearboxes from the back. Stephan looked at him. "What do you want them for?" "Parts," Harlan said. It was true. Stephan shrugged. "Take a few. They're just taking up space." Harlan took 12. He rebuilt 6 of them over that winter. The other 6 he kept for cores, for bearings, for housings in case he needed them. He stacked the rebuilt ones on a shelf he built along the east wall of his shop and labeled each one with a piece of masking tape, the date rebuilt, the seal part number, the bearing numbers, the hours run on the test jig, and then he waited. He didn't wait passively. He kept farming. He kept going to McGregor for parts and supplies when he needed them. And every time he was there, if Cote was working the parts counter, he'd ask the same quiet question at the end of the transaction. "Any more of those old gearboxes in the back? I'll take them off your hands if you want." And Cote, who was a practical man with no attachment to anything that wasn't moving product, would say yes most of the time, and Harlan would load whatever was back there into his truck and drive home. This went on for a long time. A very long time. Have you ever watched someone do something quietly and consistently for so long that the people around them stop seeing it as anything other than a quirk? That's what happened with Harlan. His wife Francoise knew he rebuilt gearboxes. His daughter Simone knew there were a lot of them in the shop. His neighbor Truscott knew that when his gearbox failed again in 2006, Harlan had appeared at his door with a rebuilt one in the back of his truck and charged him $150 installed, which was $300 less than Stefan's price. Truscott told two other farmers. Harlan told them all the same thing. "I only have what I have. Don't count on me for volume." And he meant it. He wasn't running a business. He was running a philosophy. The philosophy was simple, even if Harlan never put it in those words. Harlan's philosophy was that well-made things don't die, they just get abandoned. And abandoned things, if you have the patience and the knowledge, can be brought back. He never advertised. He never had a business name. When word got around, and in that part of Manitoba, word always gets around. He would look at whatever someone brought him, tell them whether it was rebuildable, tell them what it would cost, and either do the work or tell them he couldn't help. He charged enough to cover materials and a little for his time. Not enough to get rich, enough to keep buying seals from Arsenault. By 2012, he had rebuilt 43 gearboxes. He had 61 more in various states on his shelves waiting. His notebooks had grown to 7 volumes. He had cross-referenced the Arsenault seal to 2 other part numbers from different suppliers in case Arsenault ever retired or closed. He had sourced replacement bearings in bulk from a distributor in Winnipeg. He had made a laminated reference card for the rebuild procedure that hung on a nail above his bench, not because he needed it anymore, but because it had taken him a long time to get the steps exactly right. And he didn't want to lose it. And Stefan Villeneuve kept going about his business, never quite understanding what was happening in the shop on the gravel road outside Portage. There was a moment, somewhere around 2015, when things between Harlan and Stefan became briefly uncomfortable. A farmer named Duplessis, who grew canola on a big spread near Holland and had 4 of these machines, came to Stefan needing 2 gearboxes and was told the price had gone up to $520 per unit plus labor. Duplessis said he'd heard there was a fellow in Portage who could rebuild them. Stefan said he didn't know anything about that. Duplessis came to Harlan. Harlan looked at his units, told him both were rebuildable, and charged him $210 for the pair, installed on a Saturday morning. Word of that spread faster than it should have. Stefan heard it from 2 different people within a week. He drove out to Portage on a Wednesday afternoon and found Harlan in his shop, not rebuilding a gearbox as it happened, just sorting bolts into a coffee can. Stefan stood in the doorway and looked around at the shelves. He counted the gearboxes on the east wall. He looked at the notebooks on the shelf above the bench. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you getting your cores?" Harlan looked up. "You gave them to me," he said. Stefan looked at him for another long moment. "I'm going to have to stop doing that," he said. Harlan shrugged. "That's your call. What happened next was not dramatic." Stefan drove back to McGregor. He told Cote to stop giving gearboxes to Harlan. He looked into whether there was any legal issue with someone rebuilding his brand's components and reselling them. His lawyer told him there was not. That aftermarket repair and resale of manufactured goods was entirely legal, and that he had no recourse. He asked the manufacturer if they could put pressure on Harlan somehow. The manufacturer's rep, who was based in Saskatoon and had never heard of Harlan Boudreau in his life, said there was nothing they could do and suggested Stefan focus on selling new equipment. Stefan went home and was irritated for a while. Then he made a business decision. He would compete on service, on speed, on the relationship. Farmers needed parts fast during harvest. He could get a new gearbox in 3 days. Harlan couldn't. That was his advantage. He wasn't wrong about that. And for a few years, the equilibrium held. Some farmers went to Stefan because they needed it done now and couldn't wait. Some came to Harlan because they weren't in a rush and wanted to pay less. It was not an elegant situation, but it was a functional one. What Stefan didn't know, what almost nobody knew except Françoise and the notebook shelf, was that by 2018, Harlan had 112 rebuilt gearboxes in his shop, not cores waiting for work, rebuilt, tested, labeled, ready to go, 112. He had also, at some point in the previous few years, quietly figured out that the same seal kit worked on 3 other brands of auger gearbox with slightly different housings if you shimmed the seal bore with a washer of the correct thickness. He'd found this out by accident when a farmer from near Nipawa had come to him with a gearbox from a different manufacturer entirely, frustrated and out of options, and Harlan had measured it and written the numbers in the notebook and gone to Arsenault and found what he needed in 20 minutes. He'd rebuilt that one for $80 and charged $120. The notebook said, washer shim 2-3 mm, same seal, different housing. Verify output shaft diameter. In 2021, Stéphane Villeneuve's father died and left him a complicated estate. Stéphane had 2 brothers with competing claims on the family farm, a lawyer's bill that was growing weekly, and a dealership that had been quietly underperforming for 5 years because the brand he carried had lost ground to 2 competitors who offered better financing to younger farmers. He held on longer than he should have. That's the thing about people who've built their identity around a business. They hold on past the point of reason because letting go means admitting something they're not ready to admit. He closed Villeneuve Agricultural Supply in March of 2022. Cote called Harlan the Monday after the sign came down. There's a lot of stuff here, Cote said. They're going to liquidate the parts inventory. Auction or scrap, probably. Thought you'd want to know. Harlan drove to McGregor the next morning. He walked through the back of the building with Cote and a man from the liquidation company who was wearing a jacket too thin for a Manitoba march. In the corner of the parts bay, stacked on 2 wooden pallets and spilling onto the floor around them, were gearboxes. Harlan walked over and picked one up. He turned it over. He read the part number. He set it back down. He counted them carefully, the way he counted everything. He wrote the number in his notebook, 67. He bought all 67 on the spot. The liquidator, who had no idea what they were worth or what they were for, sold them to him for $300 for the lot. Harlan loaded them into his truck and his bird trailer and drove home and stacked them against the wall of his shop, next to the ones that were already there. Françoise came out to look at them that evening. She stood in the door of the shop with a mug of tea and looked at the new stack and then at the old stack and then at Harlan. "That's a lot of gearboxes," she said. "Yes," Harlan said. "Is there a plan?" He looked at her. "There's always been a plan," he said. "I just didn't know when it would start." What happened in the spring and summer of 2022 was that every farmer who had been quietly frustrated with Stéphane Villeneuve's prices and Stéphane Villeneuve's attitude for the previous 15 years suddenly had nowhere to go. The nearest alternative dealership was in Brandon, and they didn't carry the right parts. The manufacturer's new regional rep was based in Regina, and not especially motivated to solve problems for 100 farms in a part of Manitoba he'd never driven through. The farmers had equipment that needed gearboxes. They had heard about the man in Portage. They started calling. Harlan was not overwhelmed because Harlan had prepared to not be overwhelmed. He had a shelf with 179 rebuilt gearboxes on it. He had a rebuild procedure that took him 3.5 hours per unit. He had the seal part number memorized He had the bearing supplier's number on the wall by the phone. He had Françoise, who had been managing the farm's books for 30 years, and who sat down in early April and wrote up a simple price list on a piece of paper. Rebuilt unit, standard seal, 1-year guarantee, $185. Rebuilt unit with new bearings, 2-year guarantee, $240. Installation on farm, add $60 plus fuel. She taped it to the inside of the shop door. By the end of that first summer, Harlan had sold or installed 91 units. He had another 48 rebuilt and waiting. He had taken in 32 failed cores from farmers who didn't want them and had rebuilt 20 of those. His notebooks were now 12 volumes. Simone had come home in August and found her parents in the shop together, Françoise on the phone taking an order, Harlan pressing a seal into a housing with the same piece of pipe he'd been using for 20 years, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed her. "Dad," she said finally. He looked up. "How long have you been doing this?" He thought about it for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, he knew the exact answer. He was thinking about how to say it in a way that meant something. "Since before you asked me what I was cataloging," he said. She thought about that. Then she laughed. Not at him, at herself for not having seen it sooner. That's the part of this story that stays with me. Not the 179 gearboxes. Not the $300 that bought 67 units. Not the price list taped to the inside of the shop door. It's the image of a man in a shop on a gravel road, writing part numbers in a spiral notebook by the light of a single bulb for 22 years, because he understood something that the man with the dealership sign never did. The thing Stéphane Villeneuve never understood was that a monopoly is only as strong as the knowledge gap it sits on top of. The moment someone on the other side of that gap closes it, slowly, quietly, over 2 decades, in a shop you drive past without stopping, the monopoly is already over. It just hasn't realized it yet. Harlan never set out to put Stephenson out of business. He never wanted that. If you asked him today, sitting on the stool behind the bench, with the 12 notebooks above his head, whether he had planned any of it, he would pick up his pencil and say no. He would say he had just been paying attention. He would say that most problems, when you look at them long enough, tell you their own solution. And then he would write something in the notebook, and you would understand that the conversation was over. The shop is still there on the gravel road outside Portage La Prairie. The doors are still half open. There are still parts stacked under the corrugated steel overhang. Simone comes home more often now, and sometimes she's on the phone when you walk in, taking an order or sourcing a bearing, and Françoise has started keeping the books in a proper binder instead of a spiral notebook, though Harlan still uses the pencil. The seal part number is still the same. The piece of pipe is still the same. The stool is the same. Some things, if you do them right, don't need to change.